Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Timothy John Evans was born on November 20th, 1924 in Wales, and had a sister 3 years older than him. He never met his father, and his sister never developed a relationship with her father because he ditched the family months before Timothy was born. His mother had another daughter out of wedlock a few years later, and for a while she was raising her children all alone. His siblings seemed to thrive and reach developmental milestones on time, but Timothy was delayed in everything, from crawling to walking and even talking. His mother questioned how the school would be able to teach reading to a child who still hadn't learned how to talk. He continuously struggled in school, and things only got worse when he developed a disease called tuberculosis varicose, which developed weeks after getting an infection and doctors discovering he was immunocompetent. He missed quite a bit of school, which only hindered his learning. He eventually returned to school, but was still considered slow by many. At the age of 13, he was finally able to legibly write his name, but that was about the only thing he could write. Seeing no means to an end, he ended up dropping out at 13 years old. With nothing going for himself, in order to appear better in other people's eyes, he was known to create elaborate tales, and many knew him to be a liar. His mother remarried in 1933, and the family moved from Wales to London in 1935. In 1937, the same year he dropped out of school, Timothy traveled back to Wales by himself in order to work at the coal mines. Unfortunately for him, the rash on his foot from his disease had never fully healed and continued to give him problems, so he had to stop working. It was 1939, and he moved back in with his mother in London. World War II had recently started, so the family relocated to Notting Hill, and the following year in 1940, he met and married a woman by the name of Beryl, and by October that same year, they had their first child together on October 10th, 1940, a baby girl named Geraldine. The couple moved out of Timothy's mother's house and stayed only a few houses away. Although Timothy had struggles growing up, he never got into any serious trouble, but now on his own, things started to spiral out of control. He began to heavily drink, and Beryl started to resent him. They frequently argued, and the main thing Timothy despised about Beryl was how dirty she was. He was used to his mother doing everything for him, and not having a wife like his mother upset him. With no formal education and the inability to have a hard-working labor job, he and his wife were always without money. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and in 1946, Timothy was arrested for auto theft and for driving without a license and insurance. He attended court on April 25, 1946, and for sentencing, he was able to avoid jail time and only received a fine of 60 shillings. A few years later, in November of 1949, Timothy found out that his wife was pregnant, but he was unable to handle the news. Weeks later, he took a trip to Wales to stay with family and expressed to them how he was angry about the pregnancy, but his family encouraged him to go back home to his wife. At the time, abortions were illegal, but the couple agreed that that's what they were going to do. Timothy had initially left for Wales on November 14, 1949, and on November 30, 1949, he was walking into a police station near his apartment, informing them that his wife was dead. Timothy had made 3 separate confessions. The first confession was that he and his wife agreed to get rid of their unborn baby, so he gave her a concoction that ended up killing her. He then moved her body to a manhole, but police found nothing. Timothy also lost credibility because the manhole was too heavy for one person to lift, so they did not believe anything he said. His final statement was that he gave his daughter Geraldine to a caregiver before he left for Wales. They let Timothy walk free, but after finding no body, they questioned him again. His second confession was that he and his wife confided in their downstairs neighbor John Christie of their wants, and he agreed to do the procedure for them. He said that on November 8th, before his trip to Wales, John Christie came to perform the procedure while he went to work. By the time he got off of work, he was informed that his wife had died. Timothy said that John promised to take care of the body and he should leave town for a bit, which is why he took the trip to visit his family in Wales. They were uncertain of this confession, but they still decided to investigate and search for Burl at Timothy's flat, but they were unable to find her. They did, however, find a human thigh bone in the shared garden of the apartment, which made them even more curious. On December 2nd, they decided to search his home again, and that is when they found Burl and Geraldine's bodies wrapped in tablecloth in the wash house of his flat. The wash house was locked, and they were only able to get in with the help of John Christie's wife Ethel by using a knife. They tried looking for other human remains because of the thigh bone they had previously found, but were unable to find anything. They were unaware of the fact that there were multiple bodies in the garden that were moved without their knowledge, but Timothy was not the killer. Kids in the area were playing and ended up playing around with a skull that was taken to the police. All of this evidence, however, was later ignored during trial. They tracked down Timothy in London at the Paddington station and brought him back to the Notting Hill police station for more questioning. They showed him items of clothing, and he confirmed that they belonged to his wife and daughter. Timothy was uncooperative for hours and refused to talk up until the wee hours of the morning. Finally, he made a third confession. The confession was not in his own words, which made many believe it was a false confession, but it read, Timothy Evans had strangled Burl during an argument over money and hid the body in the wash house on November 8th. Then, he strangled his baby on November 10th before returning to Wales. Before trial began on January 11th, 1950, police were able to get the employee's register from Timothy's job, which included start and end times for his shifts, but it was somehow lost or destroyed. There were also builders working on the apartment complex at 10 Rollington Place, and when they finished for the day or went on break, they would store their tools in the wash house, and they previously told detectives that they never noticed dead bodies in there, which meant that they had been moved. When it was nearing trial, police spoke with these builders and somehow convinced them to recant their statements so they were no longer needed in court. Timothy was initially charged with the murder of his wife, who was 18 weeks pregnant, and his daughter Geraldine, but for trial, and I am unsure why, they only tried him for the murder of his daughter Geraldine. During trial, Timothy pinned the death of his family on John Christie, and Timothy's lawyers focused on John's criminal past as well as his violence. The trial lasted 3 days, and the jury only deliberated for 40 minutes. They felt there was not enough evidence to pin the murder on John, and he also had an alibi from his wife Ethel. After his guilty sentence, Timothy's defense team argued his innocence instead of pleading for no death penalty, so Mr. Justice Lewis sentenced Timothy to death. While being held at Pentonville Prison, he continued to express his innocence. He was hanged on March 9, 1950, at the age of 25 by Albert Pierpoint, 3 months after his guilty sentence. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Next week, I will be doing a story of the true killer of Burl and Geraldine. And that killer was none other than the neighbor, John Christie, who admitted to the murders 3 years after Timothy was hanged. The story will be up on my Patreon, and a link to my Patreon will be in the description box below. Before I go, big thank you to Edwin and Jeanne. Thank you for becoming patrons.